Power up. Welcome to Energypreneurs, where I bring to you the exciting new opportunities in solar power, battery, and electric cars. I'm your host, Sohel Hasni. I have been tracking and analyzing these technologies on LinkedIn and Twitter for more than 10 years. Now we meet on podcast. Good morning, Leandro. Finally, very good to see you.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about solar in the Philippines.
Yes, you are one of the leaders and young entrepreneurs. I'm really excited. So maybe you can introduce yourself first and then we go through the discussion. Thank you.
Sure. So I began this company in 2013 when there was less than 10 megawatts of solar installed in the Philippines. And we were inspired by the booming industry for solar in other countries and asked why, if in the Philippines, is the cost of electricity so much higher than in other countries that solar has not yet boomed in the Philippines. And we set off to try and expand the market, first on rooftops and then in some ground-mounted installations for the feed-in tariff. But it's only in the last few years when the country's power industry has really opened up to the possibility that solar could become a major source of the energy mix beyond just what is provided by law, but really providing for the country's growing demand for power. So I'd be very happy to talk about the growth prospects for the industry in hopes that the Philippines can not only catch up, but lead the global transition into renewable energy.
Yes, Philippines is ideal. I mean, Philippines has one of the largest geothermal. It could be solar too. So can you take me through, Leandro, I understand you have been doing very large project. You are looking at an IPO. Do you want to take us through that first, and then we go into what other possibilities are there?
Yes, of course. So our company has a number of operating solar farms, and in recent years has brought in partners like Korea Electric Power Corporation into our first solar farm in Batangas, Prime Infra of the Razon Group in Tarlac, and we are now planning an IPO of our Nueva Ecija Solar Farms project company that will hopefully be the first company to avail of the supplementary listing rules for renewable energy companies of the Philippine Stock Exchange, which were actually promulgated in 2011, but would only be used for the first time now, which are to allow for project companies of renewable energy to list even in the development stage to get financing from the public markets. But the big picture for our company is really trying to get the country's power industry, which hitherto has been dominated by coal and gas, to transition into renewables. And that's why we're really emphasizing the need to work with the incumbents, because we believe that unless the incumbents have an interest in this transition, we will not be able to achieve the rapid pace of growth that we have been aspiring for renewables in the Philippines.
Yeah, you have quite a large installed capacity now, total, no? What's the total installed capacity that your company has?
Yeah, so our company's installed capacity is just over 200 megawatts right now in terms of our company's owned solar power projects, but our thrust is really to go into developing solar energy zones where we will be leasing the land or contributing those as equity into joint ventures with the country's largest power companies. And our solar energy zones are of 10,000 hectares in initial size. So that should be an indication of where we think the country's solar development is headed if we can convince the replacement of coal and gas power plants with solar.
Yeah, I mean, coal and gas may be not there yet, but coal, it's very difficult to compete just on pricing alone, no?
You'd be surprised. In the Philippines, everything is expensive, but the cost of solar power is relatively neutral across borders. So if the average power generation cost in the Philippines is between 4 to 5 pesos per kilowatt hour, or 8 to 10 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour for your foreign audience. And the global price of solar energy is now 3 to 4 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour, or 1.5 to 2 pesos per kilowatt hour. Then solar without batteries is already much cheaper than coal and gas in the Philippines. The question is really how much the batteries will add to that cost to be able to deliver a stable output. And we're seeing that around the same level as where coal and gas in the Philippines is today, you can build solar and batteries for 24-hour requirements.
Excellent. Are you looking at a large scale on-grid batteries yet?
That's a very excellent question, because we've been hinting at the project that will be announced soon, and I will allow the relevant counterparties to make the announcements. But when we've announced that we have 10,000 hectares of sites made available for the replacement of coal and gas in the Philippines, that is with an eye to those being the site for the corresponding capacity of solar and battery to replace coal and gas.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Battery is very important. I mean, I live in Rockwell, as you know, this is power plant mall. It has a small substation. Every time I look at the space, saying someone can build a large building here and put enough underground batteries to replace that little substation that is supporting this area. So that sort of challenges and that sort of opportunities will show up. No, there's so many alternative use of small embedded substation in the cities to provide the same service. No,
right. I think that the majority of the capacity will need to be built in the places where the solar farms are located, and those are in the provincial areas. So that has really been the constraint for the growth of solar in the Philippines. That even if generation prices are 10 cents per kilowatt hour and the solar prices are now 4 cents per kilowatt hour, the supply is the constraint. And that's where we came in, and having been developing these sites for the past 6 years, offered to allow these existing power companies to put up solar farms in these ready-to-build sites. So yeah, we're hopeful that with solar now being quite quick to build, and with the country having a power crisis expected in the next year and two, that solar will be able to uniquely meet the country's shortfall in supply.
So you are not looking at embedded battery in the distribution systems yet that will take the peak of peak sort of balance and improve the load factor. So you're not going there yet.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I began this business as a big believer in distributed generation, because it is intuitive that if solar is scalable, then why not make it distributed? But we've realized that not only is the capex much higher for projects that lack the economies of scale, that what is often underestimated is the cost of developing and getting the customers to adopt this distributed generation. So the fully priced cost of a solar rooftop or a on-site battery installation is much, much higher than a very, very big installation in selected places in the high voltage interconnection points of the Philippine grid. Consequently, we believe that over 90% of the country's solar and battery installations will be these large centralized systems. So if we really want this thing to gain scale, to replace conventional fuels it's going to need to be led by centralized generation.
Okay, fair enough. So you are looking at onshore for the time being, or you're also looking at offshore solar or floating solar?
It's a matter of cost, and where the additional cost of using floating solar technology is greater than all of this unused land in the Philippine countryside, that we should just use all of the low-hanging fruit first, just like with wind. People are using up all of the onshore wind sites in developed markets before going into the offshore. But 20 years is a short time in the power industry, and before you know it, maybe we'll need to use the offshore as well.
Yes, I hope so. How did you, I mean, I get fascinated because you are really one of the youngest entrepreneurs in the Philippines that I have met, and leading the solar charge. How did it all start? Do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, so I actually invested my life savings into Tesla at the time that it was a stock adjusted split of $5 per share, and I understand it's now over $1,000 per share. So I'm starting to second guess whether it was wise to invest the proceeds into Solar Philippines instead of just keeping the stock of Tesla. But seeing the excitement of the company's growth in 2012, when I first invested, to 2014, when I sold the shares to put up our first power plant, I really thought that the same exact business model that Solar City, their rooftop installation business, was doing in the US would have been applicable in the Philippines. But as I mentioned, I realized that solar rooftop has its own barriers to scale. And I think that's one of the things that I've learned in the past years, that in business you have to extract the principles from the successes and failures of other companies, but you cannot assume that the same cookie cutter approach will work. You need to have a approach that is tailored to the given market. And I think that flexibility has also been useful, because as you said, like, we're an entrepreneurial company. We're trying to always find the best business model for the Philippine market. And that nimbleness has allowed us to, I think, meet some of the needs of these larger, slower Philippine power companies, to the point that now that they want to do solar, we are here to support them because of the flexibility that allowed us to get in position years ago.
Yeah, and also in the Philippines, rooftop solar below 400 kilowatt don't have access to the feed-in tariff. That may have also contributed to the fact, no?
I think the feed-in tariff is no longer applicable
No,
in the
no longer
Philippines.
there, but I'm saying when it started, the feed-in tariff was also, the threshold was above 400 kilowatt had access to it. So like rest of the world had, anybody residential putting a rooftop solar would have access to some form of feed-in tariff through net metering. But the Philippines, that came quite late, no?
Yeah, so I think that I may have stood on more rooftops than almost anyone else in the Philippines in 2013 to 2015. And that's where I can really say that the constraint for rooftop solar in the Philippines is underestimated to be in terms of the technical difficulty of rolling them out on these metal sheet roofs in the Philippines that are subject to very high wind speeds and a very strong rainy season. Unlike in Europe, where I believe they have mostly roofs where you just put ballasted solar panels, and the available space is also much less, because we don't really have like very big homes, or that many big industrial rooftops like in developed countries. The Philippines is very much still a developing country, so the prospect of having like a 10 kilowatt system in everyone's home is not for the Philippines, when average power consumption per household would be such that the properly sized solar system would be less than 1 kilowatt per Philippine home. So, all of these little inputs, I believe, are the main reasons why rooftop solar will not become as big in the Philippines as it is in more developed countries. But just the same, like we're trying to make the solar revolution happen in its own Philippine way, namely through ground-mounted systems in the areas around Manila.
Okay, so you think rooftop not just delayed, it may not happen for quite some time because of all those constraints.
We need to make the Philippines a high middle income country so that every Filipino can have a big house with a nice roof. Until that point, 95% of Filipinos will not have homes that are eligible for solar rooftop installations.
Okay, so what about off-grid? Because the same thing, if I pick up your last sentence, like in Bangladesh, it was in Al Gore's speech many years ago now. I mean, of course, we know more than 4 and 5 million off-grid systems have gone to all the poor households or real distributed people who are not connected. Now, Philippines with the 7,000 island, that would have been an ideal situation as well. I know that you mentioned I think you had a strong opinion against off-grid when we met at the Asia Clean Energy Forum many years ago.
So I think that maybe a younger version of myself would say Leandro's been brainwashed by the utilities. But I strongly believe that there's a reason why 100 years ago distribution utilities were invented and we weren't all making our own power from gensets in our homes, because there's massive economies of scale to having one company put up these very cheap copper wires that provide electricity to your home when you need it. Because if you want to have a standalone system, you need to build so much redundancy to make sure that, when you're having a party and you're consuming 10 times more power than you are this morning, that the lights won't go off. So, all of these technical reasons are why I think, having centralized generation with distribution makes a lot of sense. But I think people are also thinking, but the Philippines is an archipelago. But the Philippines is actually one of the most densely populated countries in the world. And that density is actually what makes distribution utilities very formidable to compete against here, compared to in sub-Saharan Africa, where we don't talk about it much, but we actually have teams trying to develop projects in these other countries. So we actually have a pilot project in Nigeria, one that is also in development in Kenya, and we've seen the difference in those countries. You have far greater distances between villages, and so the cost of putting up a line will be far greater than the benefit of scale of centralized generation. But in the Philippines, every village is like next to each other. So I think if I was the Department of Energy, I would just be funding grid extensions so that everyone can get cheap, reliable power from the grid. Because the grid's wholesale generation price can sometimes go like very, very low. Why generate expensive small-scale electricity when you can just get this cheap electricity plus the cost of a copper wire? However, people say, what about islands? The countries unserved or underserved remote grids are not as great as people expect. Perhaps 5% of the country's population for less than 1% of total power demand. So yes, for that niche market, there should be a special program. But the country's population is much more concentrated in the main islands where grid extension makes sense more than what people's image of the Philippines is like.
Well, Philippines, everyone drives cars, tricycles. There is no massive trains and public transport, right? Which is a big and efficient transport, centralized. So I will like to defer you on that. Maybe a future version of Leandro in 5 years' time, we can have another chat. I'm sure I have quite a strong view on off-grid, but let's not get there. But maybe we can have another chat in the future. But I see what you're saying, yes, centralized makes sense because of human capacity and many other reasons. But for hydrogen to happen, and you see there's so much hype going on about hydrogen, world will need, I was looking at the number, 6,000 additional gigawatt of electricity. Well, all of Philippines is about what, 25 gigawatts. So if that happens, doesn't matter how, solar will be half a cent a kilowatt hour. So that might change these big numbers. Anyway, I'm just curious one thing though. You mentioned about Tesla shares, and then you went to Tesla's followed their solar city model. Why didn't you go into electric cars? You have any views on that, on electric car in the Philippines?
Very simply that we are not a technology company. We're trying to fix the distribution of already proven technologies in the Philippines. So of all of Mr. Musk's businesses, Solar City was actually the least technological one. And yeah, we dream of the day when the Philippines can lead in the development of new technologies, but I think we're going to need to lower the price of electricity first to have a more developed country, to have more R&D in this place. Until then, we should fix our more basic problems.
So you still think that electric vehicles not technology for Philippines to invest yet?
No, I mean the development of the technology. But in terms of the use, I'm not an expert by any means, but I believe that the density of the Philippines makes it quite appropriate for an early adoption of electric vehicles. So I think ADB has really led in trying to take the lowest hanging fruit of the jeepneys, soon the buses, and I think it will also be a really exciting opportunity for the country's power industry to see petroleum phase out and electricity demand shoot up.
Did you get any time to look at some of the discussion in COP26?
Yeah, I did get to watch a lot of the programs, and it's a little disappointing that there hasn't been more decisive action, but I am eternally optimistic that the free market will solve this climate crisis, because the technology has always surpassed the expectation of policymakers. Until today, groups like the IEA are saying 30% solar by 2040 or something like that. When we think, if this thing is now worth 2 cents per kilowatt hour in much of the world, and it's trending down to 1 cent per kilowatt hour, as you said, green hydrogen will make this thing available for even a higher percentage of the year, then I think that the effects of these low prices will become apparent in the coming years as making solar the largest source of energy around the world. And that will not even require more action, like to tax carbon by governments. Of course, all of that will help, but the falling costs will, I believe, eventually save the world from the over concentration of fossil fuels in our energy mix.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I mean, I also big believer that the technology will solve climate change. We may not fully know which one yet, but solar obviously one of them that will drive many things, including the EVs and everything else. Okay, different topic. What is the total install capacity in the Philippines for solar? You mentioned you have 200. What's the total roughly? Is it a few gigawatt yet?
Oh, no, so there's probably just 1.2 gigawatts in the Philippines to date. And that's not moved much since 2016 when the feed-in tariff ended. But it's just about to double in the next year or so, because our own company, I apologize, I didn't adequately answer your question earlier, is constructing an additional almost 1 gigawatt over the next 1 year from sites that we have been developing over the last 6 years and have brought in partners and raised financing to roll out. Now that the price has made it competitive with the wholesale price in the Philippines, and that the DOE is rolling out all of these policies to mandate renewable energy procurement. So would really credit the DOE for mandating renewable portfolio standards, because we spent much of the last 5 years convincing utilities solar is now 3 pesos per kilowatt hour, coal is 5. Why don't you buy more solar? And these utilities are not really cost sensitive as much as they are regulation sensitive. So you really need policy to make these utilities move fast. Nonetheless, I think eventually, even without policy, transitions happen, right? But it's quite helpful that the policy in the Philippines is now also there.
Yeah, I mean, that's very good. I'm just looking at a very macro level. If you say the current installed capacity is about 1200 megawatt and Philippines population is about, say, 100 million. So it's about 12 watt per capita in a sense. I think Germany has about 600 watt per capita, and Australia has the highest right now, about 800 watt. And I'm talking to a government in Central Asia, Turkmenistan. So I was telling them they can be the highest in the world by investing 1 kilowatt per capita. They have only a population of 5 million, and we are working on a 5 gigawatt vision somehow. So I was just thinking, yeah, Philippines needs to, like, if you really want to be the world leader, you have to go into almost close to, I don't know, 500, 600 watt per capita, which is quite significant, no?
So as you said, big picture, if I may paint the supply and demand of solar in the Philippines.
Yes, please.
Since 2016, there hasn't been much demand because of the price and the lack of regulation. But the renewable portfolio standards have now been set such that 35% of the country's energy will need to come from renewables by 2030. And that solves back to around 30 gigawatts of solar. And between 2022 and 2030, there's going to be this gradual increase from the current to that 30 gigawatts. I would say that there's going to be around 10 gigawatts of solar that needs to be built in the Philippines based on the country's power demand by 2025. And so focusing on 2025 first, the challenge is going to be that there's not today 10 gigawatts of sites that can meet this 10 gigawatts of demand. And that's where our company is focused on right now, which is fixing the gap of the sites for this 10 gigawatts of demand. So if the Philippines can indeed take solar up to over 10 gigawatts by 2025, then we're not going to be quite at the Australia, Germany level, but 100 watts per capita hopefully is not something to scoff at.
That's pretty
And in terms of a percentage of the country's energy mix, it should be at maybe 12 to 14% solar penetration by that 10 gigawatt milestone in the middle of the decade. But again, that's I think what is deemed achievable by much of the industry right now. But we think with the advent of a lower cost storage, that 12, 14% energy share will be broken, and we'll be seeing 30, 40% of the country's kilowatt hours coming from solar by the 2030s.
fantastic. No, I think you are right. If we start with 100 watt to, if you can get to 30 gigawatt, that gives almost a 300 watt. That's a quite, it will take it to almost a leading position in ASEAN with that sort of numbers. Are you tapping into a resource called JCM, Joint Credit Mechanism, for your solar? Are you aware of JCM?
We think that what all these multilateral organizations are doing to help renewables is great, but it's not our company's core competence to navigate all of these administrative requirements. So we're really focused on local sources of financing, and are seeing that we can grow this business that way. But if someone can give us a concessional financing with a little paperwork, we'd love to apply.
Yeah, I mean, I will send you a link if you're interested. JCM is a Japanese government's Japan joint credit mechanism. They basically will buy your carbon credit equivalent, like a CDM used to be old days, in advance before you develop the project. So they want to buy, and so that they can offset with other industries. So if you have interest, I can send some information your way.
Yeah, I do really welcome partnering with Japanese companies, because we have discussed projects with many of the Japanese trading houses that are active in the Philippines, and they have mentioned the likes of the JCM program as something that can be tapped into. But I just think, practicality speaking, a Philippine solar developer will probably have a hard time navigating all of these requirements. But that's why I think these programs are there, to give the foreign businesses of these national champions from, let's say, Japan, a means to penetrate other markets, isn't it?
Okay, Leandro, now there may be a lot of young entrepreneurs out there who wants to be you. What do you tell them? I mean, of course, solar is going to be big globally, still a long way to go. So do you have any vision for them? What should they do?
That's a very hard question, because I think we're very, very lucky to have been in the right place in the right time in 2013. And if I began this business 2 years later, I would have missed the feed-in tariff, and we wouldn't have had the momentums in place to be a first mover in developing the solar farms for today. So I think the principle from that is just to be very curious, trying to explore many new opportunities that are not yet being served by the older, more established companies. And if one just keeps an open mind, then maybe one day one finds the next big thing. So even in our case, I think that once we hit 30 gigawatts in the Philippines, there might already be an oversupply of solar, and maybe the country will need more wind. So we'll need to find something else to do with our time at that point. But yeah, it's all about just being curious, I think.
So, and young entrepreneurs just have to look for a specific opportunity, and solar will bring a lot of that, no?
Well, I think it's already quite late for solar in the world. And I think that the much talked about next big thing in power could very well be hydrogen. So I think that young people need to go where there's less competition, and that's no longer solar. It might be hydrogen. It might be something that by definition we are not even aware of, and that's what the great value of someone finding first will be.
Yeah, for hydrogen to be viable, solar needs to be way, way cheaper than what it is now. So all those hypes are based on a big assumption. So let's see. I mean, of course, a lot of governments, developed country governments.
I think we need cheap electrolyzers. So if anyone listening to this podcast can send us a proposal for a competitive electrolyzer, we would love to try it out.
Yeah, and cheap solar too, right? All of them combined. Where do you think your company will be in the Philippines? Philippines, where you'll be? You mentioned that, okay, 10 gigawatt solar, 30 gigawatt eventually by. So where do you see yourself in the Philippines? Because you have this large land that you have, and you want to facilitate others to grow, right? And so you can be a partner. Do you see the vision? What's this IPO about, and how can people be part of that slice?
Yeah, our vision is to have all of the countries' power companies become fellow believers in solar energy and drive the country to this 100 watts per capita, eventually 300 watts per capita that you earlier mentioned.
Mhm.
And we're very hopeful that with recent developments that may soon be announced, that will be achieved. So we are very happy to just play a supporting role and letting the country's big power companies take uh, the prize of leading the ownership of power plants, albeit on land that we have provided them.
Okay. Is there a large solar association in the Philippines where people can, how does people get more information about what's happening in solar in the Philippines?
So the nature of solar is that in every country there's always many people that are in the solar business, but the unique aspect of the Philippines is the great concentration of market share in the country's largest conglomerates.
Mhm.
So that's why in this talk I've kept on emphasizing the need to make those incumbents buy in to the solar revolution, because if they aren't, then the country is going to remain dependent on coal and gas for a much longer than otherwise time.
But you do have a wholesale electricity market, as you mentioned before. Solar with batteries, without those incumbent, can directly bid into the market price, no?
Well, when I was a young man of 25, I thought the same. But now that I'm very old at 28, I realized that no matter how competitive new technology becomes, if the incumbents in the Philippines are not going to benefit from it, this revolution will not happen as we like.
Ooh, that's a very strong statement, and I guess there are a lot of learning behind that, definitely. What about the electric cooperatives? I mean, Philippines has more than 100 of them, no? Beyond the main distribution company, Meralco, you have scattered more than 100 small uh, vertically integrated distribution companies, and they rely on diesel, no? That would be, theoretically, outsiders looking in would think that that would be a very easy market to target, no?
Yeah, so as you noted, there's over 100 electric co-ops,
Mhm.
which serve the country's rural areas, but
Mhm.
it's only actually around 25 to 30% of the country's power demand
Mhm.
that is within the captive market of these electric co-ops.
Mhm.
And we think that it will not be the critical path to increasing the share of solar in the Philippine grid, to be working on convincing each one of these co-ops, which each comprise, let's say, zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.5 of the country's energy requirements, to switch to solar. I think they will be more followers of the country's larger, whether urban distribution utilities or corporate customers. Sorry, I should clarify that you pointed out that because they're running on diesel, it would be a lower hanging fruit. But I earlier noted that it's like 5% of the country's population and perhaps 1% of its demand that is running on diesel. And most of these electric co-ops are connected to the grid, and so have a similar energy mix
Okay.
as the urban utilities.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, thank you, Leandro. I learned quite a bit from this discussion. Is there anything else that I could have asked you or you want to share?
I think we've covered quite a lot. I just thank you for this opportunity to talk about the prospects for solar in the Philippines, and I really hope that the listeners will help convince more of the institutions in the Philippines to support large-scale solar projects, because it's really from that acceptance of solar being able to be done at large scale that we're suddenly seeing a glimpse of what the future energy mix of the Philippines can be like, and hopefully it'll just continue to become more and more accepted by the mainstream.
Thank you. How can people reach you? Where can find your company?
My email is leandro@solarphilippines.ph.
And then, of course, you have a website. I'll share that as well.
Yes, solarphilippines.ph.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us this week. If you haven't done so yet, subscribe to our show. Also, leave your comments and review if you enjoyed today's episode. Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter at @shasni for updates. That's SHASNIE. Once again, this has been Energypreneurs, connecting you to the innovative opportunities in solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles. Stay tuned.